Of course, those were the words that he would never say out loud. But no wonder Nanfeng and Fuyao's faces changed when they heard about the silver butterflies. They must have had a hard time at the hands of the silver butterfly's master, together with the 2 generals that they served. Your Highness, did Hua Cheng do anything to you? An official asked, as if Shilian should be missing an arm or a leg. He didn't really do anything. He just... Shilian stopped. Just what? He couldn't possibly say that Hua Cheng had only just hijacked his sedan, held his hand, and strolled with him in the woods. Shilian reorganized his thoughts and said, "He broke Xuanji's spiritual array at Mount Yuzhen and took me inside." A wave of muttering swept through the crowd. After a while, an official asked, "What do you all think of this?" Just from the voice alone, Shilian could imagine how the various officials looked as they shook their heads and opened their palms. Who knows? No one knows what he wants. He's just playing with us. What the hell is he thinking? No one can read that Hua Cheng. Although Hua Cheng had been known as the devil incarnate, Shilian didn't think that Hua Cheng was that scary. And all things considered, Shilian had Hua Cheng to thank for his help in the northern case this time around. Either way, his first mission after Ascension was complete. It was predetermined that all merits from the northern case would be counted under Shilian's name, but that old mayor was so overwhelmed with grief over the death of his daughter that he didn't actually remember to recompense prayers until much later, and all the merits were discounted. Yet somehow, a little bit here, a little bit there, and a lot of oversight everywhere, Shilian was somehow able to repay the 8,880,000 merits. Shilian was at last debt-free. Feeling light and high-spirited, Shilian decided he'd now focus on being a good god, and it would be great if he could make acquaintances or friends with the other heavenly officials. Although the Heavenly Court communication array was generally peaceful, it would turn boisterous once things got busy. Sometimes, if an official was feeling good or had encountered something interesting, they'd share it in the array, and there'd be merriment. Although Shilian didn't recognize most of the voices, he would listen silently, but he couldn't always remain invisible. After a while, he'd randomly join the conversation. That's really quite interesting. I read this pleasant verse in passing, and I thought I'd share it with everyone. Here's an effective cure for back and leg pains. Thought I'd share with everyone. Unfortunately, every time he'd share these mindfully selected, physically and mentally beneficial tips, the communication array would go silent. Until finally, Lingwen couldn't take it anymore and told him privately, "Your Highness, the things you're sharing in the communication array are nice, but even those who are hundreds of years older than you wouldn't share those kinds of things." Shilian felt a little depressed. He wasn't even that old, so how did he end up becoming the old man amongst the heavenly officials who couldn't keep up with the trending topics of the youngsters? Probably because he'd been away for too long and had always lived a solitary life without a care for the outside world. Alas, it couldn't be helped, so whatever. He gave up and became less depressed. But there was another problem. Until now, there were still no new shrines built for him in the mortal realm. Maybe there were, but the heavens hadn't found them yet, so there weren't any records. Even the old lords of the ground and soil had shrines. As a formally ascended official, one of the 3 times at that, having neither shrine nor temple nor followers was pretty awkward. But as awkward as it was only other heavenly officials who felt awkward for him. Shilian personally thought it wasn't that bad. One day, on a whim, he suddenly thought, if no one worships me, I'll just build my own shrine. No one knew how to respond to this. What kind of god would build his own temple to worship himself? It was pure tragedy at this point. No matter, Shilian was used to receiving awkward silence the moment he spoke, and thought amusing himself wasn't anyone's business anyway. It would make for an entertaining anecdote. So he jumped back to the mortal realm. This time, he landed in a small village in the mountains called Puji. Rather than a village, it was more like a hillside hamlet. With green trees and clear waters, it was a pleasant country scene with continuous stretches of rice paddies. With such beautiful scenery, Shirley thought that he landed in a really good place this time. There was a small dilapidated shack on a hill, and upon asking around, Shirley learned that it was a decrepit place that no one lived in anymore. Once in a while, a vagrant would sleep a night in it, so the villagers told him to make himself at home. Well, wasn't that just perfect for him? Shirley walked towards the shack. As Shirley walked closer, he realized that the shack looked decrepit from afar, but was literally crumbling upon closer inspection. 2 of the 4 columns that held up the rectangle-shaped shack were probably rotted through. When the wind blew, the entire shack would shake and creak, possibly ready to collapse at any time. But it was still within Shirley's range of acceptance. He went in for a look and began to tidy up the place. The villagers were quite surprised to see that someone was actually going to settle in that shack, and all came to check Shirley out. They gave Shirley a huge, warm welcome. Not only did they donate a broom to help him with cleaning, and watched as he swept until he was covered in dust, they even gave him a basket of freshly picked water chestnuts. With their skin peeled off, the water chestnuts were white and crisp, fresh and juicy. Shirley squatted in front of the doorsteps and munched on his water chestnuts. He then put his hands together, thankful for this blessing. He decided to call this place Puji Shrine. Puji Shrine already had a table inside that could be used as the altar after a couple of wipe downs. Shirley busied himself with cleaning this and that, and the villagers soon realized that this young man was building a shrine of sorts. Curiosity overtook them, and they questioned him. "Which god are you going to worship?" Shirley cleared his throat and said, "Yes, this shrine will be for the Prince of Xianle." Everyone's face went blank. "Who is that?" Shirley replied, I don't know either. He's a prince, I think." "Oh, so what does he do?" "He probably watches over you and keeps you safe, while collecting junk in passing." The villagers asked excitedly, "Then does this prince oversee the blessing of wealth?" "It'd be pretty good if you don't get blessed into debt," Shirley thought to himself and gently replied, "I'm afraid not." The crowd started throwing suggestions at him. "Why not worship the watermaster? For wealth, it'll bring in good money." "What about Ling Wenjun? Then maybe our village will produce a scholar." A girl shyly offered, What about? Shirley maintained his smile. "What about?" "General Zhu Yang," she completed. If Shirley really built a Zhu Yang shrine, Feng Shen would probably shoot him dead on the spot with an arrow. After roughly cleaning his shrine, all that was left that Shirley needed were an incense burner, some fortune shakers, and other miscellaneous sundries. But Shirley forgot the most important thing, the statue of a god. He put on his bamboo hat and stepped foot out the door. Oh yeah, there was no door either. He pondered for a moment. This shack definitely had to be repaired. And so Shirley wrote and put out a sign out front. "Please kindly donate to the renovation of the shrine for the accumulation of good merits." Shirley went on his little journey and entered town. To do what? To eat and to do what he did best. In fairy tales, gods didn't need to eat, but in truth it was hard to say. The Almighty could certainly extract and absorb the necessary spiritual energy directly from sunshine and rain dew. But the problem was, it wasn't a matter of ability, but rather, why would you? Some gods, due to their cultivation methods, required clean internal organs and could not touch even a drop of mortal grease. If they were to ingest mortal sustenance, it would be as if they had food poisoning and they would get diarrhea. Thus, they would only ingest cleanly grown spiritual fruits or magical beasts that had life-prolonging and and power-strengthening effects. Shilian didn't have those problems. With the cursed collar on, he was no different than a mortal. He could eat anything, and through experience, nothing he ate could kill him either. Even if it was a bun that had been set aside for over a month, or a cake that had gone moldy, he could eat it all without harm. With such a body, he could pretty much get by with just collecting junk. In comparison, building a shrine cost him money, while collecting junk made him money. So ultimately, truly, collecting junk was better than Ascension. Shilian had the looks and grace of a saint, so he got the upper hand when collecting junk. It took him almost no time to collect a giant bag of scraps. On his way back, he saw an old ox cart that was piled high with hay. The cart seemed to look like one he saw before from Puji village, so it should be going in the same direction as him. He asked for a ride, and the cart driver tilted his chin to signal him to get on. Carrying a big bundle of junk, Shilian climbed on to take a seat. It was only when he settled down that he realized that there was someone else lying on the other side of the tall stack of hay. This person, whose upper body was hidden behind the hay, had his left leg up over his right. It seemed as though he was lying there, with his arms pillowing behind his head, taking a rest. He looked so carefree and at ease that it made Shilian a little envious. That tight pair of black boots on a pair of long legs was a sight pleasing to the eyes, and it reminded Shilian of a different pair that walked with him at Mount Eugen. Shilian could not help but sneak several more looks to confirm that there were no silver chains on those boots, which seemed to be made of some animal's pelt. This is probably the son of some aristocrat coming out to play, he thought. The cart shook as it drove. Shilian pushed back his bamboo hat and took out a scroll to read. He didn't really care for worldly affairs, but after having created too many awkward situations, he figured he'd better study up a bit. The cart rattled and time passed. Looking up, they were traversing through a maple grove, a sea of flaming red in a field of green. The rustic charm of the mountainous countryside, with fresh grass that refreshed the mind, was extremely intoxicating. But Shilian could not help but give a slight start. A long time ago in his youth, when he cultivated at the Royal Holy Pavilion, the entire mountain of maple was like this, shimmering like gold, intense like fire. The unforgettable sight before him now inevitably took him on a trip down memory lane. Shilian watched for a long time before looking down at the scroll. The first few lines on the scroll were thus: "The Prince of Shanle ascended thrice, once as a martial god, twice as a misfortune god, and thrice as a rubbish god." Well, all right, Shilian said aloud. If you think about it, a martial god is no different than a rubbish god. All gods are equal. A snicker came from behind, and a voice said, "Is that right?" The youth on the other side of the cart lazily drawled. People naturally love saying that all gods are equal, and that all beings are equal. But if that was true, then all those different gods wouldn't even exist. Shilian looked at the young boy, who was still languishing there without showing any intention to get up. The boy had probably interrupted out of boredom. "You're probably right," Shilian said, and smiled. Shilian returned to his scroll and continued reading. Many believe that, as the god of misfortune, any paintings or writings of the Prince of Shanle have the powers of a curse. If placed on the back of a person or on the main entrance of a household, then the cursed person or household will run into all sorts of bad luck. It was hard to tell whether this was the description of a god or of a ghost. Shilian shook his head. He couldn't bear to read on any more about himself. It was probably better to read about the other prominent gods of today, so that he wouldn't be discourteous if he ran into them and ended up not being able to tell them apart. A villager had mentioned the Watermaster earlier, so Shilian moved on to find info about the Watermaster. The Watermaster Voodoo controls water and wealth. Most merchants have a Watermaster shrine in their stores and homes to pray for abundant wealth. Shilian thought it strange. How does the god of water relate to wealth? The youth behind the hair responded, Merchants use the waters to transport goods, so they always pray to the watermaster for peace and safety, promising this or that. After a while, the watermaster became the god of wealth. A pro was giving him answers. Shirlian turned around. Really? That's interesting. The watermaster must be very powerful then. The youth smiled mockingly. Yeah, the infamous water tyrant. Hearing his tone, Shirlian didn't think that the boy thought highly of that heavenly official. It didn't sound like he was complimenting him either. The water tyrant? The youth replied languidly. It all depends on him whether a ship can sail. No offerings, no sail. That's how he received that nickname. Kinda like General Zhu Yang and the Sweeping General. Infamous gods usually had a nickname or two between the realms. For example, Shirlian was known as the laughingstock of the three realms, the infamous freak, the jinx, the outcast, etc. Usually, it was fairly disrespectful to use those nicknames on heavenly officials. Like if anyone were to call Mu Qing the Sweeping General, he'd surely fly into a rage. Shirlian made a note to himself of what not to call the watermaster and said, I see. Thank you so much for your enlightenment. He stopped and thought that this youth was a rather intriguing conversationalist. He continued, My friend, you look young, but you know a lot. The youth replied, Nah, I'm just bored. I read whatever when I'm free. In the mortal realm, it was easy to find books on lore that spoke of the stories of gods and ghosts, the subjects ranging from their kindness and grudges to trivialities. Some were real and some were fake. It wasn't odd that the youth knew so much. Shirlian put down his scroll. Then, my friend, you know about the gods, but do you know about the ghosts too? Which ghost? The youth asked. Shirlian replied, Crimson Rain Sought Flower. Huachang. The youth chuckled and finally sat up when he heard that name. He turned around and Shirlian's eyes suddenly lit up. The youth was about 16 or 17 years old. His tunic was redder than maple leaves, and his skin was white like snow. With eyes as bright as stars, he looked askance at him with a smile. He was exceptionally handsome, but there was an inexplicable hint of wildness in his looks. His hair was tied in a loose ponytail, crooked and carefree. The cart was just driving through a forest of flaming red maples, where maple leaves were dancing their way to the ground. A leaf playfully landed on the shoulder of the youth, and he blew it off softly. Then he looked up at Shirlian, speaking with the shadow of a smile. What do you want to know? Ask away.